And I can make you wanna stay. And I can make you wanna stay.
And we're live. You're on.
Hello. What I thought I'd talk about here, and I've got a perfect Austrian-specific example to start with, is the whole question of why creativity is so necessary in life and why we make a fundamental mistake, which I think happens all the time, and I think the creative industries have made this mistake worse. We make the mistake of looking at creativity as an optional extra, when in reality, it's absolutely essential. And I'll start with a very, very simple example, okay, which is that if you look at nearly all of the most successful businesses that have started in the last 20 or 30 years, the really successful billion-dollar businesses, none of them make sense to begin with. And in many cases, even when the business sort of makes sense, the real reason for the success of the business is something to do with a creative insight into human perception rather than a conventional, logical business creation. And so I'm going to reel off a list now, and I'm going to start with Red Bull, Dyson, the Five Guys burger chain, bottled water, Nespresso, Amazon Prime, okay? And I can continue, Starbucks, add Starbucks to the list if you like, and to a degree, Apple, okay? None of these businesses was the product of sequential logical thought. The businesses were either the result of an almost unplanned leap of faith in some way, or else they were the product of an extraordinary insight into human psychology that more logical people had never noticed. So let's start in Austria with Red Bull, which was, of course, a brilliant billion-dollar company founded by an Austrian marketing guru. And I want you to imagine something. Imagine that Red Bull didn't exist. And imagine you were in a meeting of a very large corporation. And the purpose of the meeting was this. If we look at the non-alcoholic cold drinks market in the world globally over the last 50 years, it's been dominated by two things, water and Coca-Cola. Well, a lot of people can make water. A lot of people can produce and brand water. We don't have a monopoly there. But how can we get a share of the Coca-Cola market in terms of non-alcoholic cold drinks that aren't water? And the first three assumptions you would have made if you'd been a conventionally logical thinker would have been these. We have to produce a drink that tastes nicer than Coke. It should cost less than Coke. And it should come in a really big bottle or can so people get great value for money. They get a lot of refreshment for their dollar. Now, here's the problem. The most successful attempt to compete with Coca-Cola, by a long way, over the last 30 years, is inarguably Red Bull. And Red Bull comes in a tiny can, it costs a huge amount of money, and it tastes kind of weird. I mean, when they researched Red Bull, they went to a company in the United States which only researches among its respondents the taste of carbonated drinks, of fizzy drinks. And the company reported back to Red Bull, they said, this is the worst drink we've researched in the entire history of our operation, okay? Normally people are indifferent or they're unexcited or they're just merely being polite, but we never get hostility normally. Normally people say it's a bit sweet. It's a drink for my kids. It's not really for me. I'd rather drink Coke, okay? Here, when they researched the taste of Red Bull, people actually said things like, I wouldn't drink this piss if you paid me to, okay? They were actually hostile in market research. And what's extraordinary about it is that what we have to understand is only one thing to understand this extraordinary success of Red Bull. People don't buy products, they buy what they mean. What something means doesn't just depend on what it is, it depends on the context and the stories you tell about it, okay? Now, had you marketed Red Bull as a great tasting, refreshing drink, I'm fairly confident it would have failed, okay? The product would have been the same, the price would have been the same, the small can would have been the same, the taste would have been the same, but it would have failed. What I think was spotted either by accident or on purpose was something different, which is that Red Bull is a terrible drink, okay? I know it's your national beverage, okay? So I apologize for saying this, okay? But it's not a great drink, but it's a brilliant drug, okay? Or it's a brilliant placebo, okay? It's both. It has pharmacological, psychoactive effects, but it's also a brilliant placebo, because what do we know about drugs? We expect them to taste strange, okay? We know that drugs are more effective if you tell people they're expensive. So painkillers, analgesics, Nurofen, ibuprofen, if you brand the drug, if you make it expensive, it works better, okay? Because a large part of the efficacy of pharmacological, particularly psychotropic substances, is in the psychology, it's not in the chemistry, okay? And so a high-priced drink in a tiny can that tastes weird is a terrible drink. But as a drug, it's utterly brilliant, okay? Now, they didn't sell Red Bull as the great taste of Red Bull. What a refreshing drink it is. They sold it on the premise that Red Bull gives you wings. And it's so successful that you can run a Formula One team on the back of it for the fun of it, okay? There was also an even better thing, which made it a very bad drink, but a very good drug, which was, in the UK at least, and in large numbers of countries, it's not legal to sell it to kids under 16. Now, that's a terrible thing if you want to be a popular drink. If that happened to Fanta, it would be a disaster, okay? If you weren't allowed to sell Fanta to kids under 16, it would be a disaster. But as a drug, okay, being banned for sale to people under 16 basically says this is great stuff, okay? The small can, that says this is great stuff, because the lizard brain, the way we perceive meaning is, in the context of something being psychologically active, is they've got to put it in a specially small can because it's so potent that if they gave me the whole 330 milliliters, I'd probably go doolally. It says we've got to restrict the dose of this. Drugs come in small packages, they cost a lot of money, and they taste weird, okay? So understanding this basically creates a problem, because most businesses prize rationality and sequential reasoning above all else. The way to enjoy high status in a business is to be as rational and sensible as you possibly can. And yet great successes, Five Guys, Dyson, Red Bull, the great successes don't make sense. Nespresso, okay, let's give an example of Nespresso, since I imagine I'm fairly confident that Nespresso sells very well in Austria. You've got a big tradition of coffee drinking. If you'd sat there in a meeting in Nestle and you'd said, I think we can get people to pay 50 cents for a cup of coffee that they drink at home themselves, people would have said, where's your evidence? There's no evidence of this. What you're saying is basically illogical. There is a tiny group of people who get Jamaican Blue Mountain coffee shipped to their home at great expense, and then they grind it or they roast it. They roast the beans over a hickory wood fire in their shed, and then they grind it, and then they make it with Japanese coffee making equipment in, borosilicate glass. There are people who spend 50 cents on a cup of coffee they drink at home, but there are about 10 of them, okay? The idea that you could make a mass market product out of this, because people would ask people, how much are you prepared to pay for coffee? And they'd say 5 pence, 10 pence, or whatever. Okay. If you look at the coffee market, effectively, you see that the sweet spot is people paying 5 cents or 10 cents for a cup of coffee they make at home. And that's called Nescafe, and it's called Maxwell House, and it's called Carte Noire, and it's, and it's called Lavazza, and it's called Illy, okay? Now, here's the thing. Nespresso works because of a feat of psychology. And the feat of psychology is that we don't know whether something is expensive or cheap. Okay, now you've got to believe me in this. Whether something is expensive or cheap doesn't depend on how much it costs. Remember, we react to meaning, we don't react to facts. And the way we derive what a price means, whether it's expensive or whether it's cheap, is not a product of how much the thing costs. It's a product of what we compare it to. Now, if you look at it, okay, we don't know what a cup of Nescafe costs. We don't know what a cup of Illy or Lavazza coffee costs. We don't know what a cup of coffee costs. We know what a jar costs, and we know what a packet of ground coffee costs. But we don't know what an individual cup costs because we've never done the maths, really, okay? And my contention is this: if you tried to sell Nespresso coffee today in a jar, okay, alongside Maxwell House and alongside Nescafe or Carte Noire, a jar for an equivalent amount of caffeine, a jar of Nespresso, should such a thing exist, would cost about 40 euros. And people would look at that on the shelf and they go, that is completely insane. There's no way I'm paying 40 euros for a cup of coffee. But Nespresso became possible. Why? Because when we put that 50-cent pod into our machine, our frame of comparison isn't Nescafe, because we don't know what a cup of Nescafe costs. Our frame of comparison is Starbucks. And we think, well, okay, it's costing me 50 cents. But at Starbucks, this would have cost me €2.80 or €3.10. This machine's saving me a fortune. The coffee's actually quite cheap. Now, if you don't believe this, my father, who's now 90, 10 years ago, he refused to get satellite television. And he's not interested in sport. He's not interested in movies or films. He just likes documentaries, news, factual television. And I said, look, you really need to get Sky television. You need to get satellite television because you've only got 4 channels. It's not enough. You like television, you're retired, you've got a lot of time to watch television. And he said, yes, I looked at that, but it's £17 a month. It's too expensive. Okay, I don't want to spend £17 a month. So I said, well, look, I'll buy it for you for Christmas. I'll pay for it so you can have it for free. Okay, no, I still don't want it. It's too expensive. It's too extravagant spending £17 a month on television. And then I tried a simple psychological mind trick. I said, it's not £17 a month. It's 60p a day. He said, why does that make any difference, whether it's 60p a day or £17 a month? I said, because you spend £2 a day on newspapers. He gets 2 or 3 broadsheet newspapers every day. I said, if you're spending £2 a day on newspapers, spending another 30% on top to get 150 channels of television doesn't seem all that crazy, does it? When you compare the price of satellite television to a newspaper, it's actually cheap. Now, interestingly, I never had to buy my father satellite TV because he said, I see what you mean. I never thought of it like that before. He went and got Sky Television himself. He still has it 10 years later, and he loves it. He goes around all his friends saying, you really must get Sky Plus. It's absolutely marvelous. And so something terrible happens, okay, in economics. If you've gone to business school, if you've studied economics, if you've got an MBA, something terrible happens to your brain, which is that you start to think that business and economic activity is all about logic, and that humans are logical economic maximizers, and they're not. Now, let me tell a very simple story here, and it's really, really important to understand, okay? Because I don't know if anybody here listening has studied economics. Given that there are 100 or 200 of you, I expect some of you have. All the models in economics assume, for the purposes of the model, that everybody starts with perfect information and perfect trust, okay? And so it assumes that people know exactly what they want, how much utility or value they'll derive from buying it. Therefore, they know exactly how much they're prepared to pay to acquire that utility. And they completely trust the person who's selling it to them. Now, if you think of such a world, that's a world where marketing wouldn't need to exist. If everybody knew already what they wanted, they knew every product on the market, they completely trusted the product to deliver what it was they expected from it, and they knew to the penny whether it was worth it or whether it wasn't worth it, then you wouldn't need marketing at all. Okay? You know, and that's why marketing tends to look like an optional extra. Because someone who's got an MBA, someone who's been to business school, sees that value is created in the factory. They don't realize that value is actually created in the mind. Because they assume that all the mental work's already been done. Okay, people already know what they want and they know how much they're prepared to pay for it. And that creates the belief that the value is actually created in the factory. And the only thing you can do is either make the product materially better, or you can make the product cheaper so that more people can buy it. Now, here's the interesting thing, okay? That economic model of the world assumes that marketing doesn't exist. And I recognized that about 5 years ago. And the reason I discovered this, maybe 10 years ago, but certainly 5 years ago, the reason I discovered it, and it's beautiful to be talking to an Austrian audience today, is that Austrian economists don't think like that, okay? So if you look at the Austrian School of Economics, which is Ludwig von Mises, Hayek, Schumpeter, all those Austrian economists never thought that way. The only definition of value in Austrian School Economics is in the mind. It's if you can create such an environment or mood or story where someone is willing to buy something, then that is value. And there's a quote from Ludwig von Mises, where Ludwig von Mises says, there is no useful distinction to be made between the value created in a restaurant by the man who cooks the food, that's manufacturing, and the value created by the man who sweeps the floor. And by the man who sweeps the floor, he means marketing and advertising. He says, you can create value by making something, but you also have to make someone want it and create the environment where someone fully enjoys their meal. And both of them contribute towards economic value. The physical component and the psychological component are both necessary to creating economic value. And the Austrian School of Economics has always been right about this. It's fundamentally right about this one fact. And one of the things I say about innovation, okay, that there are two ways you can innovate. You can innovate by finding out what people want and working out a really, really clever way to make it. That's technological innovation. But the other thing is you can work out what you can make and find a really clever way to make people want it. And that's psychological innovation. And the money you make is exactly the same regardless of the direction in which you've taken that journey. Either starting with what you can make and finding a clever way to make people want it, or starting with what people want and finding a clever way to make it. It doesn't make a difference to your profit which way round you do it. Now, here's something I only realized in the last 2 months. The standard economic model of assuming perfect information and perfect trust doesn't just treat marketing as a luxury or as an optional extra. It treats creativity as an optional extra. And let me explain how. If you look at chimpanzees, okay, and there are people out there, primatologists, who will spend literally, I mean, I'm not exaggerating here, they will literally spend 5 years of their life watching the same troop or flange of baboons or chimpanzees or gorillas, okay? One thing they notice after a while watching these chimpanzees is something that never happens. You will never see two chimpanzees cooperating to carry a heavy log. A chimpanzee may try and carry a log, okay, or lift a log. If it's too heavy, he never gets another chimpanzee in to help him. Okay, you would never see two chimpanzees carrying a log, one holding one end, the other holding the other end of the log, walking through the jungle. And the question I ask is, why not? For humans, that's more or less instinctive. Well, there are three things that need to happen before you can get two primates carrying a heavy log that is too heavy for one of them to carry on its own, okay? You need imagination, which is, I can't carry this log, but what if we both tried to lift it? So it starts with imagination. Then you need the chimpanzee who's had the imaginative idea to be able to persuade the other chimpanzee to join him in the venture of carrying the log. And the third thing you need is trust, because the second chimpanzee has got to trust the first chimpanzee enough to know that actually when they get the log back to their camp, the first chimpanzee isn't going to hog it to himself and refuse the second chimpanzee the right to sit on it. I don't know what chimpanzees do with logs, okay? But, you know, so you need three things. Before you can have any form of human cooperation or any form of human collaboration, you need three things. You need imagination, you need persuasion, and you need trust. Now, what's really interesting is that economics assumes all of these three things have already happened. Okay, so it doesn't understand the contribution that imagination, persuasion, and trust make to the functioning of a really successful economy, because it just takes those things as if they're a given. Not the Austrian school, actually not Adam Smith. Adam Smith said, why is it that humans have this particular propensity to truck and barter? Don't worry if you don't know what truck and barter mean. Most English people in the 21st century don't know what truck and barter means, okay? But it was, Adam Smith was writing in Scotland in the 18th century. And Adam Smith says the reason that humans have this unique facility is probably down to the development of language. And I was talking to an economist called Deirdre McCloskey, who's an American economist, and she believes, and indeed there's evidence to show this, that persuasion, by which I mean sweet talk, imagination, ideas, actually drive 25% of economic value. But what's happened is the economists have ignored the imaginative bit because they assume that's already happened. Okay. And what they look at is how can we, once we've had this fantastic idea, assuming it's already happened, how do we now carry logs as efficiently as we possibly can? Okay. And so the real magic of what makes us humans is exogenous to the model. And her claim is that actually, 25% of economic value is effectively created by persuasion and by imagination. It's by people having ideas, trying new things, and then persuading other people to join them in a joint enterprise of some kind. And that doesn't just apply to buying and selling things. It applies to all the things we do voluntarily. All the things we do, like, I'll look after your kids when you go out on Saturday. If you look after my kids, that's not an economic exchange, but it's an exchange of value nonetheless. And so creativity has been treated as external to the economy, when in fact, without creativity, there's no economy at all. And I think this is a terrible thing that's happened, and I think it's happened for very interesting reasons. So let me tell you about this. Here's a very simple thing, okay? People have tried to make economics look like physics. They've tried to make it look like what they think of as a mathematical science, okay? Now, a very useful thing happened to me when a biologist told me, physics is a science of laws. Biology is a science of exceptions. The way you make progress in biology, and again, I'm talking to an Austrian audience, so Gregor Mendel would be the perfect Austrian biologist, I think, to name check at this juncture. Okay, the way you make progress in biology is you look for exceptions or oddities. You don't look to generalize, you don't look for laws, you don't look for universals, you look for strange things. In Darwin's case, it happened in the Galapagos Islands, perhaps, okay? And you go and say, that's strange, why do all these birds have different shaped beaks? And I think the great effort of economics is trying to make economics into a science of generalizations and generalities when it really should be a science of exceptions. The way we make progress in marketing and creativity is to look for extraordinary things and work out what they mean and why they work. And so by the way, I think it's really important that most of science outside the field of mathematics, okay, actually even including mathematics, most of science works backwards. You actually have an accidental discovery and then you seek to explain it. Okay, so there's a fundamental need for creativity, not only in our business and marketing world, there's a fundamental need for creativity in science, because ultimately there are more great ideas out there that you can post-rationalize. In other words, you can hypothesize them, notice them, stumble on them by accident. Penicillin. Okay, there are far more great ideas out there that we can post-rationalize than there are great ideas we can pre-rationalize. I don't think you could have arrived at Red Bull through a process of rational thought. I think all you can do is see that it's popular in Thailand with lorry drivers, okay? And notice, I don't know what it was that caused Red Bull to be created in Thailand in the first place, by the way. I'd be fascinated to find out. I think what you can do is you can simply observe things and then ask questions why. I don't think logic, and now the problem is we've created a business culture where the appearance of being logical is the high status behavior. We don't judge people in business on the quality of the outcomes of the decisions they make. We judge them on the quality of their pre-reasoning. And therefore, it's a lower status activity within business to go, I've noticed this weird thing. Shall we investigate? That's a lower status thing to say, I've developed a mathematical model that suggests we ought to build the factory here. And so most people in business are in the business of pre-rationalization, despite the fact that most significant economic value, I would argue, is created through the process of discovery, which actually happens backwards. So what's going on? Well, the first thing we've got to do is we've got to stop this idea that there are creative people and there are rational people and there is a necessary battle between them, okay? What we have to understand is that looked at from a different point of view, the rational activity within a business and the creative activity within a business are not only complementary, they're mutually interdependent. In other words, the one doesn't work without the other. Okay, so instead of creating this view that creative people and rational people must always be at loggerheads, we have to understand that they're two complementary processes which are interdependent and where each is actually dependent on the other for its effective work. And again, if you want to understand how this properly works, have a look at the science of biology. Okay, and in the science of biology, particularly have a look at bees. Because I'm fairly sure, actually, it was an Austrian scientist who got the Nobel Prize for actually discovering the concept of the waggle dance. And the waggle dance was the discovery that bees over time, bees are about 20 million years old as a species, bees have developed a signaling method whereby they can tell other bees where to go in order to find an existing source of nectar and pollen. And that was an absolutely extraordinary discovery. It was an extraordinary thing to have developed, which is that somehow by accident, because I don't think bees have imagination, but bees have developed a form of persuasion, which is the waggle dance. They can actually encourage other bees to take advantage of sources of information that they know. And it's an information sharing system, and it's really important. But then bee scientists later noticed something else which interested them, which is that a certain percentage of bees, around about 20%, don't follow the waggle dance, and they go off at random. And I want you to think of the waggle dance bees as the rational bees, and the rogue bees, the bees that don't follow the waggle dance, as the creative bees. Now, looked at through the lens of an accountant, looked at through the lens of short-term optimization, the random bees are an inefficiency, because in the immediate term, they would bring in more nectar or more pollen if they obeyed the waggle dance. In fact, if all the hive obeyed the waggle dance, it would be a much, much more efficient way of collecting pollen and nectar in the short term. Okay, so they thought, this is strange. We've had 20 million years of bee evolution. And yet, strangely, there are still bees that don't follow the waggle dance. You would have expected evolution to get rid of this inefficiency by now, surely. But still, 20 million years on, there's still a load of bees which are just going off at random. Ooh, let's go over there, okay? And they're the creative bees. Why has evolution allowed the creative bees to survive when looked at from a very narrow perspective? They're actually costly and they're inefficient. The typical random bee journey will bring in less nectar or pollen per energy expended than the typical obedient bee journey. But here's the thing, okay? They looked at it and they modeled the hive and the behavior of the bees through complex system modeling. And what they did is they said, if you don't have the creative bees, the hive becomes over-dependent on what it already knows, and it gets trapped in a local maximum, and it starves to death. Because as soon as its existing knowledge, it becomes too focused on exploit and not enough focused on explore. In the short term, if you focus purely on exploit, you do very well. You have a very efficient nectar and pollen collecting operation. But two things happen. You become over-optimized on what you already know. And if some cows break into the field, your favorite field, and they eat all the flowers, suddenly you don't know where else to go. But the second thing that happens is you can never get lucky. You never make an exciting discovery. You never go over the hill 3 miles in that direction and go, shit, there are a whole load of flowers here we never knew about. So if you don't have variation, you don't have creativity, and you don't have experimentation, there are two problems. One, you become fragile and very vulnerable because your business is too dependent on what it thinks it knows and fails to acknowledge the value of what it doesn't yet know. And what it doesn't yet know may just be through ignorance, or it may be because the environment's changed. And the second thing is vitally important, which is that you never get lucky. Okay, one of the reasons to do mass media advertising rather than targeted advertising is because sometimes when you do mass media advertising, you discover a market or an opportunity that you never expected. It was never part of your plan when you set out to advertise, but nonetheless, the fact of being famous just exposes you to unplanned, unpredictable upside. Okay, and so the role of creativity is two things. It effectively creates resilience in the mechanism because it actually creates a degree of variety. But looked at through the very narrow lens of economic efficiency, okay, it looks like a cost. It isn't a cost. It's essential to the survival and functioning of the entire thing over the whole period. And this is the thing. The great thing about bees is they don't have personalities. I may be doing them a huge disservice. Maybe bees have fantastic personalities to other bees, but I don't think they have much in the way of personalities. If bees had human personalities, I think it's safe to say that the obedient bees would hate the creative bees, and the creative bees would despise the efficient bees because they'd see themselves as engaged in an entirely different activities in opposition to one another. In fact, it's completely wrong to look at those two entities as being in opposition. In fact, they're both essential components of a successful hive. And what you need to do is to learn to respect the other person. I have a huge exaggerated respect for people in retail logistics. During this pandemic, I thought we'd be running out of food. Now, the people in retail logistics are highly rational people. They optimize things, they measure things, everything they do is quantifiable. They don't pay much attention to psychology. It's the left brain activity. And it's essential because if the obedient bees didn't exist, the hive would be wasteful. But if the creative bees didn't exist, the hive would be over-optimized. And it's actually the creative tension between the two that means that bees have survived for 20 million years. And we need to understand that the other side of the thing isn't wrong. There's no point in having creative bees if they don't share their findings with the rational bees. And there's no point in having rational bees if the rational bees don't listen to the creative bees occasionally. Okay? That's how the system works. And so understanding the the complementarity and interconnectedness of the creative and the rational approaches to business, rather than viewing each side viewing the other with barely disguised horror, is ultimately the future of business enlightenment. And that's how you create a whole hive business, and that's how you create a whole brain business. The rational people on their own don't have all the answers. They never will do. If you're a rational person and you set out to create Uber, you'd say, we need the taxis to turn up sooner. The creative guy who came up with Uber had a brilliant psychological insight. He said, people don't really care about how long the cab takes. They hate the uncertainty of not knowing where the taxi is. So we'll put a little car on a map on the app, and then everybody will feel much better about waiting for a taxi. Okay? And so that's a psychological solution to a problem. It requires insight, it requires imagination, it requires creativity. Okay, it's not using the standard metrics. It's saying no, the problem isn't duration, it's uncertainty. That's the case where you need as a rational person to listen to the creative person. But the creative person has also got to understand the value created by the rational person, because your idea is not going to be any good unless you've got someone who can scale it. The problem we have in modern day business, however, is it's asymmetrical. All creative people have to present their ideas for approval to rational people, but it never, ever happens the other way around. When rational people decide that the product's not selling, so we're going to drop the price, they don't go, they just enact their decision. They go straight ahead. They don't go to creative people and effectively say, we think the correct, rational, logical answer is this, but have you got a better idea? Never happens the other way around. If we can actually get rid of that asymmetry and rebalance things between the two, what you've got is a great business. Steve Jobs has a great business. They manufacture the phones really efficiently, okay? They don't get the phones manufactured by hippies in California, but they do get them designed by hippies in California. That's the point. And understanding the complementarity between those two things and the fact that they're not at loggerheads, they're actually essential to each other's functioning, that's the way to finally have what I call a whole brain approach to business. So that's me. And I'm totally open now for questions for the next 20 minutes or more, as long as it takes. But thank you very much for allowing me to speak.
Hi, Rory. Thank you very much for your talk. It was super interesting. And we have already received a few questions from the audience.
Yes, the first question is, do you think that ethics in advertising are being neglected? Like Nespresso sells a great lifestyle, yet the coffee beans are sourced very unethically by underpaid workers.
Actually, I'm going to defend my clients at Nestle for that. I don't know that that's true. And by the way, I certainly hope it's not true. I know that you can buy now fair trade Nespresso coffee, for example, and I would hope that my impression is that they actually work directly with high quality individual plantations in countries where they have a relationship direct with the grower and they treat the grower fairly and well. Now, by the way, they would be very silly, and I'm saying this to Nestle in public, if they don't do that already, they'd be very silly not to do it. Because one of the problems with things like coffee is they're bought and traded like commodities, and the grower gets badly treated in the operation. Once something becomes a commodity, the grower has no potential to command a premium, and essentially it's a race to the bottom with all the money being made essentially by the brand owner at the end. By selling single origin coffees, as Nespresso does, some of the value. Now, the other thing is, because Nespresso has a high margin, you can treat the growers fairly and you can pay them well. Why not? Why not do that? Because seriously, I will investigate this more, because your question is fair. Okay, it's a fair question. And I think economists have done enormous damage to people like farmers by treating everything like milk as a commodity. Did you know that sheep farmers don't make any money out of shearing their sheep? They sell the wool to help cover the costs of shearing, which they have to do in the summer months anyway. The wool is basically shorn at a loss. Okay, That's terrible. It's a miracle fiber, okay? This is awful. And one of the things I think we can do is look at oil, right? Petrol, gasoline. I can't buy fair trade oil, right? I would pay a few cents a litre more to have oil that wasn't produced by oppressive regimes, okay? I'll leave it to you to guess my definition of what oppressive may be, but I think it's not unreasonable if I'm going to pay someone, if I was going to go to I wouldn't go to a petrol station where the owner of the petrol station didn't allow his wife to drive a car, okay? Right? So why would I buy gasoline from a country where women aren't allowed to drive? Fair question, okay? So one of the things is that brands allow consumers to hold businesses to account. But that process breaks down whenever you have something that's traded as a commodity. Because all you can do when something's traded as a commodity is effectively just chuck your coffee into the pile and get paid the lowest possible price for it. It's arguably good news for stingy consumers who just want to buy on price. It's very good news for very mean people, and probably very good news for economists who I suspect became economists because they're naturally stingy people. It's generally bad news for capitalism as a whole system. What I want is people producing very, very good single origin coffee in Colombia, which means they don't have to grow cocaine anymore, and being paid a fair price for selling it because I, as a consumer, will pay several pence a cup more in order to have my coffee produced under reasonable conditions. And so actually, in defense of Nespresso, by hipsterizing coffee and by producing, the one I use at the moment, there's a Colombian one that's very good. I'm not a total shill for Nespresso. I love Nespresso, but okay. But by having single origin coffees and by actually telling the stories of the growers and having direct relationships with the people who grow it, that's actually ethically good news, not bad news. Now, I'm just going to pause here for a second. There is no doubt in my mind for 1 second that you can use advertising techniques for bad things, okay? You can use advertising techniques unethically. You can sell people things. Generally, it doesn't pay, but there are categories where it does pay. So products like pensions or funeral plans, which you only buy once and you only discover the product is bad when it's too late. You can deceive people when they buy those things. Generally, if you con people into buying a shampoo that is a rubbish shampoo, okay, then they discover it's rubbish. And actually, the best way to kill a bad product is good advertising, okay? So in some categories of product, actually, advertising will kill bad products faster and it will make good products succeed faster. So it's doing an ethical job, okay? In other areas of business and politics, you might argue that political advertising, where, you know, by the time you voted, you only know whether the government's any good 5 years later, political advertising can be extraordinarily unethical. Okay, I don't think anybody should make any secrets of that. David Ogilvy refused to get involved in political advertising because he thought it, you know, he basically thought it was unpleasant and unethical, and also it was unfair to the people in the agency who disagreed. So David Ogilvy historically wouldn't do political advertising for that reason. So I'm not for a second saying that advertising can't be used for bad. It can be. I mean, you know, there have been very, very unpleasant regimes in history which are very good at marketing, if we're being objective about it, okay? There have been some pretty nasty dictatorial regimes which are just very good at marketing and branding. So I would not for a second suggest that it isn't possible to use these things unethically. On the other hand, let's look at things interestingly, okay? If you can get people to pay for meaning rather than goods, okay? Meaning is much less carbon intensive to produce than material is. And one of the things is, if you can get people to pay, as people get richer, okay? As people get richer, if you can get them to pay more for less stuff, by imbuing the added value in the shape of meaning and psychology rather than the shape of something else, okay? In other words, if rather than having to add leather seats to a Tesla, you can make non-leather or vegan leather seats, cool, okay, right? We can be part of the great process of dematerialization, where increasingly the economy and economic growth is not being used to pay for materials or carbon-intensive things like gasoline, jet fuel, manufactured goods, but is being made to pay for software like Netflix, okay?
Rory,
What's the most environmentally friendly thing I can do in the shirt industry? I can get you to pay £80 for a really, really good shirt that you really, really love, which you keep for ages. And when that shirt gets a bit old, because it's okay, go on eBay, okay? If you've got a 20-year-old Hermes handbag, it's still got a value, okay? The brand value has survived. A 20-year-old Primark handbag is worthless. It's in landfill. Okay, so let's look at, I'm not for a second saying you're wrong to criticize advertising or to say that it can be used for bad aims, but we can equally use it for extraordinarily good aims. Brand value actually allows goods to hold their value for much, much longer than their material value actually survives.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rory. I hate to say, but we're already over our time. But thank you very much for coming. And we got the opportunity to talk a little bit more in Gathertown via our website. You can also join us in Gathertown and take a look at our digital festival space, and maybe we see each other there.
It's been a pleasure. but be proud of your economists, folks. They got it right.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
So, thanks, Rory. See you.
Bye. Huge pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.